For years, Vladimir Putin believed he held the master key to Europe. Gas pipelines and oil terminals acted as silent weapons, stretching from Siberia to the heart of the EU. At his command, energy flowed or stopped, warming homes or freezing industries. It was a power he displayed with confidence, even arrogance. Many remembered his warnings Europe would collapse without Russian fuel. Germany would crumble under the weight of winter. The continent, he claimed, could not survive without the empire he built on oil and gas. But power built on fear is fragile. And when Europe finally rose to confront the looming threat on its eastern border, it did something unprecedented. It dismantled the very system that had kept it vulnerable, not with tanks or troops, but with decisions sharper than any blade. The first crack appeared in Bulgaria, a country whose fuel lifeline had been dominated by a massive refinery operated by Lukoil. For decades, that refinery symbolized Russian influence in the Balkans, yet when US sanctions threatened to cut Bulgaria off from its own energy supply, the illusion of reliance shattered. The Bulgarian government acted with remarkable speed, passing new legislation in the span of seconds, assuming full authority over the refinery, and preparing to sever Moscow's hold before the crisis could engulf the nation. This was not defiance for the sake of politics. It was survival. Bulgaria understood that clinging to an old partner during a new global reality would only lead to catastrophe. For the first time, a Balkan state chosen as one of Moscow's safe zones had stepped away. The move did not remain isolated. Across the continent, the shockwave pushed larger nations to confront their own vulnerabilities. Germany, long accused of being too soft on Moscow due to its energy dependence, began preparing to permanently nationalize the Schwedt refinery, a facility crucial to its national supply, yet still linked to Rosneft. Romania joined the shift as well, warning publicly that its Lukoil-owned refinery could not remain under Russian control if the country hoped to secure its energy future. It became clear that Europe was undergoing more than a policy shift. It was shedding an old skin. One by one, the pillars supporting Russia's energy dominance collapsed under the weight of a new geopolitical reality. The very infrastructure Putin believed would cement his leverage had become the continent's greatest liability, and Europe was determined to remove it, piece by piece. The sanctions from Washington acted as a catalyst. Countries were presented with a simple but brutal dilemma: maintain business ties with Russian companies and face catastrophic penalties, or take decisive control of their energy sectors. The choice was obvious, and the transformation spread across the map like wildfire. In just months, a structure Moscow had built over decades crumbled. The pipelines that once symbolized influence now symbolized risk. The refineries that once fed Europe now threatened to choke it. The markets that once guaranteed Russia's economic strength were being reconfigured to shut it out entirely. Putin's energy empire was not defeated in a battlefield. It was undone through the collective will of nations refusing to be held hostage again. The tool he once wielded like a weapon slipped from his grip, and Europe watched as it shattered on the ground. This was the moment the balance of power shifted, not with fanfare, but with deliberate, calculated decisions by nations determined to reclaim their autonomy. The continent had seen enough. The bridge connecting Russia to Europe was not merely closed, it was demolished. And in the ruins of that bridge lay the first chapter of Putin's unraveling. The most devastating blow to Putin's influence did not arrive through military force, public condemnation, or diplomatic isolation. It came quietly, wrapped in the language of law. The United States engineered a sanctions framework so precise, so unforgiving, that every nation tied to Russian energy suddenly found itself standing before an unavoidable crossroads. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Continue partnering with Russian companies and face severe economic punishment, or break the bonds immediately and reclaim a future untouched by sanctions. There was no middle ground, only survival or self-destruction. For years, Moscow had relied on a group of European states that remained within its gravitational pull. These countries were held not through ideology but through necessity. Pipelines that delivered gas also delivered loyalty, and contracts that ensured energy supply ensured political restraint. But the sanctions shattered the illusion that dependence could be politically harmless. They forced governments to confront a brutal truth. Ties to Russia were now liabilities, with the potential to cripple entire economies. Slovakia was among the first to grasp the danger. A nation long dependent on Russian gas, it suddenly realized that loyalty could cost it its sovereignty. Rather than cling to old partnerships, Slovakia's leadership accepted a lifeline from Poland, an offer to interconnect their gas systems and provide alternative supplies. This decision marked a complete reversal of decades of policy, a quiet acknowledgement that dependence on Moscow had become a strategic risk too great to bear. Slovakia, once seen as firmly within Russia's reach, stepped out of its shadow. But not every country reacted with the same clarity. Hungary moved in the opposite direction. Its leadership, instead of reducing reliance on Russian oil, doubled down. Rather than diversify, it sought protection not through structural reform, but through political alignment that might earn exemptions from sanctions. It was a gamble made not for the nation's long-term stability, but for the preservation of its existing ties with Moscow. Hungary stood alone in Europe, resisting the pressure to break away from Russian energy, hoping that temporary diplomatic favors would shield it from the storm. This divergence revealed the true power of the American sanctions design. It did not merely punish, it exposed. Nations were forced to show their hand, to declare whether their allegiance lay with the West's economic ecosystem or with the shrinking world of Russian energy. The unified front Russia once counted on dissolved into fragments, some choosing adaptation, others clinging desperately to the old order. Even countries that had previously tried to balance relations between East and West found that such neutrality was no longer tenable. The new global reality demanded clarity. The consequences of standing too close to the Kremlin were immediate and severe, and governments understood that refusing to adjust could mean economic collapse. The trap had accomplished far more than disrupting business. It rewired the political geography of Europe. It transformed long-standing strategic relationships. And most importantly, it revealed the vulnerability at the heart of Putin's influence, an empire built not on loyalty, but on necessity. Once energy dependence could no longer guarantee stability, the alliances woven over decades began unraveling at remarkable speed. The world watched as Russia's circle of influence hollowed out. Countries that once acted as buffers or sympathetic voices started drifting away. The firmer the sanctions became, the clearer it was that no state could remain tied to Moscow without sacrificing its own economic future. Those who chose survival moved swiftly. Those who hesitated found themselves isolated. In the end, the legal trap succeeded not because it coerced nations, but because it forced them to confront reality. Russia was no longer a partner, it was a risk, and when the choice came down to national survival or maintaining an old alliance, survival won every time. This was the chapter in which Putin's influence fractured quietly, decisively, and without the need for a single shot fired. For years, Serbia was the anchor Moscow relied on, a steady partner in a region where alliances often shifted like sand. In the eyes of the Kremlin, Serbia represented loyalty, predictability, and cultural closeness. But loyalty becomes fragile when it collides with economic survival. And Serbia's crisis began the moment global sanctions pushed beyond politics and struck the very core of its daily life. The structure of Serbia's energy sector made the country uniquely vulnerable. Its national oil company, NIS, was not truly Serbian in ownership. More than half of it belonged to Russia's energy giants, Gazprom and Gazprom Neft. This arrangement had once been sold as strategic cooperation, a partnership meant to guarantee stability. Instead, it became the trapdoor beneath Serbia's feet. When Washington's sanctions expanded to target Russian energy firms more aggressively, the effect on Serbia was immediate and severe. Because the country was landlocked, it relied heavily on the Janaf pipeline that ran through Croatia. This line was its artery. Without it, fuel distribution would grind to a halt, and once the sanctions came into force, Croatia blocked shipments to any entity connected to Gazprom. Overnight, Serbia's main source of crude oil was cut off. The shock rippled through the country. Fuel reserves had a countdown attached, each day pulling the nation closer to empty pumps and shuttered heating systems. Even transactions became tangled in geopolitical knots. Payment networks like Visa and MasterCard, following compliance with sanctions, stopped processing purchases at NIS and Gazprom-branded stations. Citizens with full wallets suddenly discovered they were powerless at the pump, and foreign travelers found themselves stranded. A modern nation, in the center of Europe, was thrown into a crisis reminiscent of a bygone era. The government, facing a situation more dangerous than any political disagreement, was forced to confront a truth many had avoided for years. Serbia's dependence on Russia was not a strength, it was an existential vulnerability. Ties that once symbolized friendship now carried the risk of economic collapse. Officials issued warnings. Oil supplies were projected to run out by the end of the month. Refineries could not operate without new shipments. Industries would stall, transportation networks would slow, and daily life would descend into uncertainty. This was not a theoretical threat. It was a ticking clock. Under this pressure, Serbia's leadership began taking steps that would have once been politically taboo. The president initiated contact with Ukraine's leadership to discuss regional stability, an act unthinkable at the beginning of Russia's invasion. Statements emerged indicating that Serbia might reconsider its refusal to join sanctions against Moscow. The path toward the European Union, once pursued cautiously, became a lifeline rather than a diplomatic preference. One statement from Serbia's energy ministry revealed the true nature of the crisis. NIS, the company tied to Gazprom, barely impacted Russia's massive energy sector. To Moscow, it was nothing more than a minor asset in a vast empire. But to Serbia, it represented the cornerstone of national energy supply. This asymmetry exposed the painful reality that loyalty flowed only in one direction. Serbia was forced into a choice it never wanted to make: stay aligned with Russia and watch its economy collapse, or protect its sovereignty by reclaiming control over its own energy future. The crisis made the decision for them. This was the moment the facade cracked. Serbia was no longer the unwavering ally Putin imagined. It was a nation fighting for survival, recognizing that dependency on a distant power locked in a costly war had become incompatible with its own needs. The crisis reshaped the political landscape of the Balkans and signaled that even Russia's closest partners were preparing to step away. Serbia had reached its breaking point not through ideology, but through the simple, unavoidable reality that a country must place its own people above any foreign alliance. For months, the Kremlin clung to a single promise: if Europe walked away, the East would step forward. This belief became the backbone of Putin's strategy, the narrative he repeated with unwavering confidence. He spoke as if China, India, and Turkey would absorb every barrel Europe refused to take. The East, he insisted, was waiting with open arms. But global markets do not bend to political narratives. They obey pressure, risk, and opportunity. And when the sanctions tightened, the East responded not with loyalty, but with caution. China made the first subtle move. Its state-owned refiners, massive corporations with influence that reaches far beyond the country's borders, reassessed their position. The risk of secondary sanctions, the uncertainty of navigating a volatile global market, and the need to maintain stable trade relationships pushed them toward restraint. Shipments of Russian oil began to slow. Refineries that had once been eager buyers paused their procurement. The shift was quiet, almost unspoken, but unmistakable. A pillar of Putin's fallback plan was starting to wobble. In India, the shift was more abrupt. The country had become one of the largest buyers of discounted Russian crude, capitalizing on low prices after Europe shut its doors. Yet when sanctions tightened and Western pressure increased, India's major refiners corporations that anchor the nation's industrial and transportation networks began stepping away. Some suspended purchases entirely, while others reduced their intake to minimize exposure to legal and financial risk. At the same time, Saudi Arabia moved swiftly to fill the gap, offering competitive prices and reliable terms. India responded to stability, not sentiment, and the Kremlin's expectations evaporated in the wake of market logic. Turkey's transformation carried its own significance. As a NATO member, yet historically balancing relations between East and West, Turkey had provided a substantial market for Russian crude. But Turkish refineries depend on uninterrupted access to European export channels. To protect their businesses, they reduced Russian purchases and diversified aggressively. Oil from Kazakhstan, Iraq, Brazil, and Angola flowed into Turkish ports with increasing frequency. The switch was driven not by ideology, but by necessity. Russia had become a risky business partner, and risk has no place in an industry built on razor-thin margins. Together, these decisions reshaped the global energy landscape. They proved that national interest outweighs political alignment, and that markets respond to pressure far faster than governments do. Countries that Moscow assumed would stand by its side chose instead to safeguard their access to global finance, technology, and infrastructure. For the Kremlin, this was not merely a setback, it was the unraveling of its last major escape route. The dream of pivoting to Asia, of replacing Europe with booming Eastern markets, faded under the weight of hesitation and strategic self-preservation. Putin had bet on the idea that the world needed his oil more than it feared sanctions. He discovered the opposite to be true. The consequences stretched far beyond lost revenue. With every cancelled shipment and every paused purchase, Russia's place in the global economy diminished. Countries that once saw Moscow as a valuable supplier began to view it as a source of instability. The energy empire built over decades, the pipeline diplomacy that had shaped geopolitical dynamics, no longer provided leverage, it produced isolation. What collapsed here was not only a strategy but an entire worldview. The East was not a guaranteed refuge. It was a competitive marketplace, and in that marketplace, Russian oil tainted with geopolitical risk became the least attractive option. Putin's assumption that the world would rally behind his discounted barrels proved to be his greatest miscalculation. The East had turned away, quietly but decisively, and with that shift, the foundation of Russia's global energy strategy began to crumble. As Russia's influence strained under the pressure of sanctions and collapsing energy markets, a quieter but equally devastating shift unfolded along its southern frontier. The South Caucasus, long regarded by the Kremlin as a space firmly within its historical sphere, began drifting in a direction Moscow could neither predict nor prevent. And leading this transformation was Azerbaijan, a nation whose strategic position made its choices impossible for Russia to ignore. For decades, Moscow viewed Azerbaijan as a state that would remain compliant, or at least neutral, in regional affairs. The assumption was built on proximity, shared energy corridors, and Russia's self-appointed role as the stabilizing force of the region. But influence built on assumptions can fail without warning. In this case, it began unraveling in two decisive steps. The first blow came from the energy sector, the very arena where Russia believed it retained the strongest leverage. Azerbaijan closed its port infrastructure to Russian crude, forcing Moscow to reroute shipments through the port of Novorossiysk. At a glance, this shift seemed like a bureaucratic adjustment, yet in reality it stripped Russia of a strategic outlet it had relied on for years. Where flows once moved with certainty, they now faced restrictions, shaped not by Moscow, but by Baku. This move alone signaled a profound reversal. Russia, accustomed to forcing its neighbors to adjust their energy policies, now found itself adapting to decisions made by a smaller, more agile regional power. And the message from Baku was clear. Azerbaijan would no longer facilitate the ambitions of a country increasingly defined by instability. Yet the second blow cut deeper. Azerbaijan announced that it would align its military standards with NATO, integrating its defense structures with those of Turkey and key Western partners. This transition represented far more than a technical shift. It symbolized a clear pivot toward a security architecture deliberately positioned outside of Russia's reach. A country that once operated within Soviet military doctrine was now preparing for a future connected to the West's most powerful alliance. The implications were enormous. As Azerbaijan embraced NATO practices, it distanced itself from Russia's vision of a multipolar world shaped through coercion and dependency. This wasn't a subtle realignment, it was a strategic transformation carried out in broad daylight. The Kremlin attempted to portray the region as stable and cooperative, insisting that its presence guaranteed peace. But this narrative collapsed under the weight of Azerbaijan's actions. Moscow's proclamations sounded increasingly disconnected, even delusional, compared to the geopolitical reality forming on the ground. The region was not stabilizing under Russian guidance, it was stabilizing by moving away from Russian influence entirely. What made the shift so painful for Moscow was its timing. At a moment when Russia desperately needed signs of loyalty, Azerbaijan presented the opposite. Proof that even countries that had navigated carefully around Moscow were now seeking security in Western alliances. The old assumption that fear of Russian power would keep neighbors in line was dissolving before Russia's eyes. This transformation carried symbolic weight as well. The South Caucasus had been one of the last regions where Russia could claim an enduring strategic presence. Losing Azerbaijan meant losing not only an ally, but also the narrative of Russian indispensability. It meant acknowledging that Russia's geopolitical shadow was shrinking, and shrinking quickly. Azerbaijan's pivot reflected a broader truth taking shape across Eurasia. Nations once cautious, even deferential, now saw opportunity in distancing themselves from Moscow. They saw the consequences of Russia's isolation, the economic decay spreading from its core industries, the diminishing relevance of the energy empire it once wielded like a weapon, and they acted accordingly. For Putin, the loss in the Caucasus was not a single event, it was a symbol of influence eroding, alliances weakening, and a region stepping confidently into a future where Russia was no longer the center of gravity. Russia had once believed it could shape its neighbors. Now its neighbors were shaping their futures without Russia at all. As Russia looked outward and watched allies drift away, a far more devastating crisis unfolded inside its own borders. The global realignment in energy markets sent shockwaves deep into the Russian economy, shockwaves that no propaganda could silence and no decree could reverse. What began as a geopolitical setback soon transformed into a profound internal unraveling. The decline started quietly, hidden in shipping manifests and industry reports. Tankers loaded with Russian crude waited at sea with no buyers, drifting for weeks in uncertain waters. The world had moved on, searching for safer partners and cleaner contracts, and Russia suddenly found itself holding a product no major economy wanted to touch. The volume grew until it became impossible to ignore. Millions upon millions of barrels stranded on the ocean, their value dropping by the day. Discounts became the only tool left. Prices were slashed far below global benchmarks, yet even desperation could not attract the steady buyers Russia once relied on. For a country whose prosperity was built on oil revenue, this was not merely a setback, it was a structural break. The flow of money that had fueled social programs, infrastructure, and public services began to shrink. And where the state once hid its economic weaknesses, it could no longer disguise the cracks. Industries that depended on stable state support felt the pressure first. Steel production slowed as demand collapsed. Coal mining towns operated in half-capacity silence. Rail networks reported shortages, delays, and shutdowns. The backbone of the Russian economy, its industrial heartland, was losing rhythm. This collapse did not remain confined to numbers. It spilled into human lives. Russia's monotowns, places built around a single factory or mine, faced the harshest consequences. These communities had survived for decades because their industries survived. When factories cut hours or halted production, entire towns lost their income overnight. Families found themselves without salaries in the middle of winter. Skilled workers discovered that their expertise, once valuable and in demand, had suddenly become obsolete in a shrinking economy. The pride that defined these industrial regions was replaced with fear of being left behind, fear of losing purpose, fear of a future shaped by forces far beyond their control. In these forgotten corners of the country, social wounds widened, alcohol consumption rose, crime took root where employment once offered stability, households fell into silence as uncertainty settled into daily life, and with every hardship came a deeper realization. The stability contract Russia's leadership had promised for 2 decades was dissolving. The government had long traded economic security for political obedience. Citizens were told that as long as they stayed quiet, prosperity would be guaranteed. But now, the foundation of that exchange oil money was evaporating. The wealth meant for pensions, for hospitals, for education, was no longer reaching the people. It was being funneled into the war economy, consumed by machinery and destruction rather than used to build a better future. As the external markets closed and internal pressure grew, a new truth emerged. Russia was not being isolated by the world alone. It was being hollowed out from within. The once powerful narrative of a resilient, resource-rich nation now clashed with the reality visible in every empty factory floor and every shrinking paycheck. Putin's energy strategy, once hailed as the pillar of national strength, had become the source of national fragility. The collapse of foreign markets triggered a chain reaction that exposed the vulnerability at the core of the Russian state. It revealed a system dependent not on innovation or diversification, but on a single commodity that the world no longer needed in the same way. And as the world turned away, the Russian people were left to bear the weight of decisions made far from their daily struggles. The cost of geopolitical ambition was no longer measured in distant battlefields. It was measured in the fading hopes of communities across the country. The unraveling of an empire did not begin with dramatic headlines. It began with the quiet desperation of those who realized that the future they had been promised no longer existed.